here. We really appreciate this for the first annual Shorebird Festival. I want you to give yourself all a round of applause because this is pretty special. I want to thank our partner tonight in sponsoring this event, and that's the Kiawah Island Community Association and the Sandcastle staff for doing such an excellent job in helping us prepare for this event. It's always nice to have someone to partner with on something so special as this. Also, we would not be here tonight if it was not for Betty. Queen Betty, where are you? I want to tell you, this was her vision many years ago. This is something she really, really had dreamed about having, and Betty, it came true. I mean, dreams do come true, right? She wanted it to be big, and I think you've gotten your wish, so congratulations. This is quite an accomplishment. I also want to thank the team that has been working for months to put this together, and our staff member, Katie Warner, who has been our outreach specialist working on this. Katie, thank you for representing the Conservancy so well, and for all the team that will be speaking tonight. I know you've worked so hard for over a year to put this together. Also tonight in the audience, we have our trustees. Trustees, if you would just raise your hand and let people know that you are here and supporting this, let people see you. We thank you so much for participating. And as always, the mission of the Conservancy is to see that habitat is preserved, and that certainly extends to the topic of tonight in the shorebirds. So it's something that we are very pleased to work with this group and all of our partners in making this happen. I'd like to introduce Abby Sterling. She is the director of the Manomet, Georgia Blythe Shorebird Conservancy Initiative. The initiative works to raise awareness of the southeastern critical shorebird habitat. She works collaboratively among many diverse partners in the region. Tonight, Abby will serve as our Master of Ceremonies and our moderator. She is going to provide some background and some context for our program this evening. So I'd like for you all to welcome Abby Sterling.
Thank you so much, Donna. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. On behalf of the organizing committee, including the Kiawah Conservancy, the Town of Kiawah, Seabrook Island Birders, the South Carolina Shorebird Project, Audubon, South Carolina, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and Manomet, we are thrilled to present tonight's program and Red Knot reception. Tonight, we will share with you the story of the red knot, an incredible shorebird that relies on our region to complete an epic migration. We will highlight the important role of Kiawah and Seabrook Islands and share cutting-edge research that is changing how we think about red knot conservation. And we cap off those discussions with a beautiful film that captures the beauty, fragility, and awe-inspiring story of the red knot. During tonight's program, we urge you to get involved. We've distributed blank index cards on your chairs, and following the film, we will have a panel discussion where you'll have the chance to have your questions answered by folks that are on the front lines of shorebird and red knot conservation. To participate, simply write down your questions, and at any point you can hold up the cards or pass them to the ends of the aisles, and Cammie and Katie will collect those cards, and we'll use those during the panel discussion at the end. Tonight we've got three fantastic speakers who will be sharing their insights, knowledge, and passion. First, it's my pleasure to introduce Felicia Sanders, who will be sharing what South Carolina Department of Natural Resources has been learning about red knots and how they use the southeastern United States. Felicia has been working for South Carolina DNR since 2001, and she has assembled and leads an incredible team of dedicated biologists to manage, monitor, and oversee shorebirds and seabirds in the Southeast. She is truly an amazing biologist. Last year, she was named Biologist of the Year by Southeastern Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. In the shorebird community, Felicia is one of those wonderful people who, through patience, perseverance, smart decision-making, and an unending quest to learn about shorebirds with the goal of solving the significant problems they face, has truly made a difference. I'm excited that we will all get to learn from Felicia tonight. After Felicia's talk, we will view the debut of Benjamin Klopp's breathtaking film, Scarlet Skies, Red Knot Conservation in the Southeast. Ben is a biologist, photographer, videographer, writer, and presenter who documents organisms and their habitats in an effort to conserve wild places. Ben believes that beautiful imagery of nature can be a powerful tool to educate, inspire, and make positive change for conservation of habitat and biodiversity, which you will be able to see in this short film tonight. We hope that the opportunity to see our red knots through Ben's lens inspires you and fills you with pride, exemplifying the important role of the beaches of Kiawah and Seabrook Islands. And finally, joining our panel discussion, Nathaniel Watkins will be sharing his insights from a spring spent observing, counting, and monitoring red knots for an ongoing research project. Nate works for Manomet under the directions of both Felicia Sanders and Fletcher Smith, who's with Georgia DNR. Since graduating from Lees McRae College in 2018, he's worked on a variety of ornithological research projects, working with diverse species such as king rails, black-capped vireos, and whippoorwills. He might be a familiar face to some, as he spent 2 seasons working at Kiawah's banding station under the direction of Aaron Gibbon, and now spends many hours observing red knots here on Kiawah and Seabrook. So thank you all for your contributions for tonight's program. Before I turn it over to Felicia to learn more about what South Carolina DNR is doing for red knots, I just wanted to take a minute to set the stage. So I'm sure by now, at the end of the first day of the Sea Islands Shorebird Festival, many of y'all are familiar with red knots, although some of us did not get to see them on our field trips this morning. So here's a picture. Red knots are a type of medium-sized shorebird, about the size of a robin. It's possible to see them along our southeastern coasts from mid-July through the fall and winter and into spring. During much of that time, they are gray in color and may be overlooked quite easily. But this time of year, for the month of May, red knots earn their name, and they are truly stunning. In addition to molting into their breeding plumage, a rusty, beautiful red breast and an intricate red, black, and white scalloping that allows them to blend in perfectly with their breeding grounds on the northern tundra, this time of year, migrating red knots from the farthest reaches of the southern cone arrive on our shores. As you will learn tonight, red knots are one of the shorebirds that has taught us so much about long-distance migration. Some individuals travel from Tierra del Fuego, the most southern coastline of Argentina, on their way to the Arctic. Many of these birds have been marked with bands and tags that allow us to identify individuals, and years of research and resighting efforts have shown that these birds have very high site fidelity. They return to the same key stopover sites on these journeys every year, places where they know they can find abundant food resources and quiet places to rest. These are long-lived birds. One, a bird banded in Tierra del Fuego with the code B95, was resighted every year for nearly 20 years, and on every journey it returned to the same beaches. Over the course of its lifetime, it flew the distance of the moon and back. Food availability likely drives many decisions for these birds. They need calories to complete these huge flights. One critical food resource is the eggs from spawning horseshoe crabs. Along the South Carolina and Georgia coasts, we have many rich food resources for shorebirds, including horseshoe crab eggs during the spring, but other important food resources as well, like donax surf clams. That means our coast is critically important for many shorebirds, including the red knots, who may travel thousands of miles to arrive here. We are just a halfway point for birds that traverse the hemisphere. Now, you may already love and know our coast, but I wanted to take a step back and talk about it from the bird's perspective. We know from ongoing research that Felicia will talk about, and from the projects that Fletcher and Nate are working on, that red knots view our whole region as one big all-you-can-eat buffet. This region, called the Georgia Bight, has geographic features that make it critically important for red knots and hundreds of thousands of other shorebirds. The curved part of our coast means that we have a large tidal amplitude, 6 to 8 feet at the center of the bight, low wave energy, and a gradual slope all the way out to the continental shelf. These conditions are the reasons that we have expansive marshes, well-developed barrier islands, and dynamic, ever-changing sandbars and mudflats. Within the bight, there are 3 places that have been recognized by the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network as important for shorebirds: the Cape Romaine-Santee Delta region, the Georgia Barrier Islands as a landscape of international importance, and the Altamaha River Delta. We hope to add more sites within our region to this network soon. When we zoom in to the coastline south of Charleston, and even more closely to an area that encompasses Captain Sam's Inlet, Kiawah and Seabrook, and Devoe Bank, we see a landscape that has many features that shorebirds are looking for: dynamic, diverse beach habitats, abundant food resources, and quiet places to rest and digest while they are fueling up for their epic journeys. Places like this are rare. Having the numbers of birds that we have is extraordinary. To walk out on the beach here and encounter hundreds or thousands of red knots is remarkable. Red knots have been consistently feeding on the Donex clams that they eat here for a number of years, and as Felicia will tell us in just a bit, what we see here is unique. When we look at the overall population trends for shorebirds, it puts the importance of Kiawah and Seabrook into even greater relief. We know bird numbers have declined drastically. Several years ago, a group of researchers published a paper that concluded that today there are 3 billion fewer birds than there were in the 1970s. Shorebirds are one of the most imperiled groups of birds, and as you can see in this figure, where the majority of species are listed in the red, we are seeing some very widespread declines. Many of the birds showing the most troubling trends are those long-distance migrants, like red knots, who travel along flyways that connect North and South America. New research conducted in part by Manomet scientists who collaborated on the analysis of international shorebird survey data shows that over the past 40 years, 6 of the 28 species that were included in this analysis lost 50% or more of their abundance. Even more troubling, they found that the declines are accelerating or getting worse for the majority of species included in the analysis. On this figure, you can see the greatest acceleration of decline is that of the red knot, the dot here all the way to the left. Shorebird conservation is difficult because many of these birds, like the red knot, depend on geographically restricted habitats, the boundary between water and land. And these places are at risk from a variety of threats, including climate change, sea level rise, heavy recreational use, and loss of food resources. These birds have high site fidelity and depend on key places across a broad geography. This means that any action at any one site can have huge impacts at a population level. And while that may seem daunting and insurmountable, I think we can view these challenges as a call to action. Yes, if something threatens an important place on a red knot's journey, we can see significant losses of an already imperiled species. But I think the real take home here is that we all have the opportunity to make a positive change. Walking around a flock of feeding red knots, learning about their migration, appreciating their beauty through the film we are about to see tonight, means that we can ensure red knots on the South Carolina coast are well prepared for their journey. Red knots, to many of us here, represent connections and hope. So tonight, we are encouraged by your enthusiasm and look forward to sharing the research, the film, and the stories that connect us all across the hemisphere. And with that, I will turn it over to Felicia to share the great work that she, her team, and partners have been doing.
Right. Thanks, Abby. Thanks for such a huge crowd today. How exciting. Well, first I want to just recognize Janet Tebow, who is my coworker, and she also for years has been researching and trying to conserve red knots along our coast. So red knots are one of the shorebirds that nest in the high Arctic. 2/3 of our shorebirds in North America nest in boreal and boreal and Arctic habitat. So a lot of the shorebirds just kind of disappear for a month or a month and a half from our beaches and go up to the high Arctic to nest. This photo that Benjamin Clock took of a researcher looking for a red knot nest just gives you an idea of the kind of habitat these birds are going to. And so they're only up there for about a month and a half. The habitat is so harsh, maybe so cold, that if their nest fails, they just head back without a second attempt. As Abby said, they're one of the longest distance migrants in the animal kingdom. Some of them are wintering all the way down at the very tip of South America. So this journey back up to the Arctic and back to the tip of South America every single year is almost 20,000 miles. So about 10,000 miles they have to fly every single year. One banded knot that was resighted in Argentina for 13 years, it probably flew 250,000 miles, or the distance farther than the Earth to Moon. And there's also, there's also red knots that winter in the southeast, on the Gulf Coast of Mexico, and also the north coast of South America. But all these birds are flying and have many, many threats on each stop. Shorebirds are kind of unique. They stop at unique places on this huge journey in huge numbers. And every time they stop, it's really exciting. We get to see thousands and thousands of shorebirds. Like right in this area, Kiawah and Seabrook, red knots are stopping. But also this means one threat, such as an oil spill or pollution, could affect thousands of shorebirds. So as you've also heard, they have declined, and in 2014 they were listed as federally threatened. And unfortunately they've declined by about 70% over the last 20 years. And this is partly because of reduced food in Delaware Bay. And if you look at red knots and migration, you always kind of come up on the internet with Delaware Bay. And horseshoe crab harvest there has reduced their food. So Delaware Bay is known to be a very important stopover where thousands and thousands of shorebirds stop to refuel and get energy to make a next flight up to the Arctic. And reduced food of the horseshoe crabs in Delaware Bay has equaled low weight, and researchers have found that low weight equals low survival and breeding rates. But red knots were not always threatened or in low numbers. Arthur Bent, a very famous ornithologist that was at Harvard and Smithsonian, he said they were so abundant that it was even hard to get estimates of the massive flocks. And we also know they were very common early 1900s in South Carolina, so our abundance here is not just recent. In 1927, he said they were very common in South Carolina in May. So here in South Carolina, we start seeing large flocks of red knots in February, and from February to April, you'll see them on the beaches, especially here at Kiawah and Seabrook, eating small clams called donax or coquina. Beautiful, colorful clams that kind of follow the surf. When I was a child, we'd come to the beaches in South Carolina, and I just couldn't wait to see all the coquinas. I'd get buckets and watch them go down into the sand when I put water on them. So that's also the reason the knots are here. And then later when the water warms, we also in South Carolina have horseshoe crabs spawning. So on some of the beaches, the horseshoe crabs come up, especially at night, lay their eggs, and the shorebirds will concentrate in these horseshoe crab spawning areas and feast on the eggs. They may have to dig down to where they are laid, or if there's so many eggs, they might even be on the surface. And, this is a picture of Marsh Island. All these pictures are from South Carolina. So let's see. And so, oops, sorry about that. Abby, can you open So just last week, some of us went to Marsh Island in Cape Remain Refuge. It's north of Charleston, kind of near where I live. And Caitlin, she's in the audience, took a picture of shorebird eating horseshoe crab eggs. Quite spectacular, and so we know this happens in South Carolina, not just Delaware Bay. So we decided in 2010 that we wanted to start researching red knots. And to do that, we needed to capture and mark some of them. So we would meet early in the morning before the knots arrived and put up cannon nets, hunker down when the birds arrived, and then these nets would go over the birds, and then we were able to capture them, measure them, and put unique tags on them. And because these birds fly across the entire hemisphere, it's really hard to organize banding and resighting schemes and networks. So each country is assigned a different color of band to put on the bird when you band a shorebird. For example, this red one, that means it's from Chile. Somebody in Chile banded this. I actually saw this in Cape Remain Refuge, and so I know, contact people down in South America, find out its banding history. And this one with the orange band was banded in Argentina. We caught this bird at Seabrook a couple years ago, and at a meeting I had met the woman who bands red knots in Argentina, Patricia, and so I actually could email her a picture of this. Thank goodness for Google Translate. And so she told us where she had banded it and its history. And then all the birds that we're banding in the United States gets a green flag. So these birds are also connecting us with researchers. And so what do you do with banding birds? Well, you can actually try to find them. That's what Nate is going to talk about or is doing this year on the South Carolina coast. And you can get a passage population estimate by banding birds and then looking for them. So if you just surveyed outside on the beach at Kiawah and you see 1,000 knots, you don't really know how long they're staying. Do you have 1,000 knots and then next week you have a different 1,000 knots? But when they're banded, you can kind of tell how long they're staying and get an idea of how many knots are actually moving through the area. So with many partners, we found out that this area actually has about 17,000 knots that are using the beaches at Kiawah and Seabrook. That's about a third of the total estimated subspecies of red knot that comes through here. So that really puts South Carolina, specifically this area, on the map as very important. And these birds are staying for about a month and a half. And those 4 wintering populations I was mentioning, we have all birds from Tierra del Fuego coming through here, from the Gulf, from northern South America, and then those also that are just wintering in the southeast and the Caribbean. So all of that information makes this area really important for red knot survival. So we've also been putting on some tracking devices on some red knots. And in fact, a lot of people are aware of it. We actually did this 2 days ago on Kiawah. So very exciting. We've been doing it a couple years, but we're also doing it this week. So we put some nano tags on some of the red knots. And they're just really small tags that you could even put on large insects. We clip a little feathers and we just super glue them on the bird. And these birds are sending out a signal constantly, and towers all along the hemisphere are picking up that signal. Here's a map of where all the towers are currently. And it's a real collaborative research effort with everybody sharing data, all the people that are managing the towers are sending locations and identity of the birds that are passing by. And this is the kind of thing that we're learning. Because they're glued onto the bird, they don't last that long, but we're really looking at where do they go after they leave South Carolina in the spring? What is their northern route towards the Arctic breeding grounds? And we find that they're kind of taking all different routes, but mostly, majority of them are just going straight up. These dots are just towers that are picking them up. They're not stopping there. So most of them are going through the Great Lakes, and then they make a stop in James Bay or Hudson Bay. So that also makes South Carolina very important because these birds are getting ready on our beaches to make a huge flight all the way up to Arctic habitat. It's their last stop before they make it north. And we've also been putting geolocators on birds, just a different method. It's a small tracking device that is right behind this plastic flag. The only downside on this one is you have to recapture the birds to download the data. But we have recaptured some, and this is a map of one of the birds that we tagged in South Carolina. Actually, we tagged it at DeVoe Bank, just a little south of here. And you can see it goes up to Hudson Bay, then up to the Arctic. So they nest way up here, and then back down James Bay, down to South America, wintered in the very tip of South America, and then back to South Carolina. So really amazing, almost 2,000 mile migration this bird took that we banded right here. And then even more recently, we've been putting on satellite transmitters on birds. Another way to track their migration. And thank you for Pamela for taking this just 2 days ago. So this is a satellite transmitter. Again, we're just gluing it on, clipping the little feathers, and using super glue to glue it on. So it's not going to stay on for years, but we will also get its local movement and its northern route to where it's going to breed. And so last year we had 9 satellite transmitters that gave us a northern route. And again, 2/3 flew directly from here to the Arctic habitat. Really exciting, kind of more data that shows these beaches are really important for red knot survival. And then just 2 days ago, we put on 3 more satellite tags. Thank you so many people in this room that made that possible by alerting everybody that we were putting cannon nets on your beaches. And this is the kind of data we're getting from the satellite tags. This is one from last year. So we put the tag on April 23rd. It might have been at Kiawah before that date, but on May 26th it started flying, and it stopped on James Bay May 27th, then took a stop June 6th on the western edge of Hudson Bay, another stop on Hudson Bay June 10th, and then we can tell exactly where it nested on Victoria Island. We do have data until beginning of July, and then I assume the tracker fell off. The feathers grow, or it probably just fell off, and so we don't have any more data. But really informative of that northern spring route to its nesting site. And then this was super exciting. Like I said, we put on satellite tags just 2 days ago. And so this morning I woke up so excited to see where our birds had been. It was before even my first cup of coffee, which if you know me, that's like really, must have been really exciting if I hadn't had coffee yet. And so our bird made it, so we banded at Kiawah, and if you may not know the geography of South Carolina, but it went over to Otter Island, and then it went to Ash Island, then it's down at Hunting State Park and Harbor Island. I'm not really sure what that is, but there may be some errors in this. I still am 2 days new on how to interpret satellite transmitter data, and there's probably a few points that I should kick out, but this is really exciting to just see where they're going every hour now until they make their way up north to their nesting ground. And Even, some of our team are gonna go check out some places the satellite tag data is showing us they're gonna go. Nate's probably gonna go next week and see if he can find some of these birds and see what they're doing. So really, really exciting times. And why do we do all this research? Well, the goal is to protect the knots. And it's just really exciting to see what's going on at Kiawah and Seabrook and all the beaches in South Carolina. I love that the map of the geolocator bird is on the educational sign that's going out on the beach with all the stewards, and there's signs on the beaches, and education and partners and volunteer numbers are just growing. And even when I was out on the beach trying to figure out a place to trap, everybody wanted to know if I was looking at the red knots, and everybody knew. I was so impressed how the efforts have really made a difference. And I just want to end my talk with this amazing photo that Benjamin took last night. And it was of one of the birds that we put a nano tag on. So we put some more nano tags on Tuesday, and it just feels so exciting to see this bird doing well, feeding, and very excited to see what this bird is going to show us. What's next? Where is it going to go? And all the tags that we put on Tuesday. Really excited in the next months to see what they reveal. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Felicia, so much for sharing that incredible work with us. It's just, I think, getting to see the research happening in real time and how that's playing out with the conservation efforts here really does drive it all home. I'll remind everybody in the audience that if anyone has any questions, you can please write those on the index cards, and Cammie and Katie will collect those. So you can either hold those up or pass them to the ends of the aisle, and we will incorporate those into the panel discussion that we're going to have at the end. And now I will turn it over to Ben to tell us about his film.
Thanks so much, Abby. I mostly want to let my film do the talking tonight, but just a little background about the project. I have been coming here to Kiawah and Seabrook, the region, really exploring around here on the South Carolina coast and on the Georgia coast since 2018, and a lot of this footage spans all the way back minus 2020 when I was not able to come down. Just a little background, I guess, about how I came down here. Some of you have probably read Deborah Kramer's amazing book about red knots, and if you haven't, I highly suggest it. And it was her book that really pointed me in the direction to come down here. I learned in that book about Felicia and about her research, and it inspired me to visit. And when I did come down, Felicia was a wonderful and gracious host. I cold called her and told her about what I wanted to do, and she invited me to come out for a banding effort within the first few days of knowing her. So her work really inspired me to tell the story about what she's done and what she's discovered about the importance of this region to red knots, and that's really the genesis of this film. And so many people to thank, but I'm just going to let the film begin.
I've been with South Carolina DNR for over 22 years now. And when I first started, I noticed red knots because they're just beautiful. They're, especially right before they leave for the Arctic, they're in beautiful red plumage. They're really plump. They're really like a butterball turkey. They're just so full of fat to fuel their flight to the Arctic that the belly kind of hangs over their legs, and they almost just waddle down the beach. So even before I really knew much about red knots, they're easy to notice and really distinctive.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ben. That was incredible. And as everyone soaks in that incredible footage, I'll invite Felicia and Ben and Nate to come up and take a seat, and we will begin our panel discussion. Okay, well, I have a few questions to kick us off, and then hopefully we'll get some more questions coming. So feel free, if you all have anything that you're curious about, write those down, and we'll collect them and we'll pass them on so that we can get some good answers from our wonderful panelists here. Ben, I'm going to start with you. Can you tell us a little bit more about what it took to make this film? Your footage is incredible. What could you share with our audience who might want to also take photos or videos of these birds?
Yeah, taking photos of red knots is something I love to do. You all hear me okay?
Yep. Yes.
I think the biggest thing, and this is perhaps most important, to minimize your disturbance for the birds, is to be willing to get down low, and you can sort of slowly approach the birds. But when you, and I'm sure many of you have this experience just from observing them, if you make your body look, not the shape of a human, meaning standing upright, then the birds often don't pay any attention to you. A lot of the times that I'm working with knots, I slowly approach the birds, sit down, sometimes even lay down in the sand, and the birds often forage right around you. They don't associate you with any kind of danger, and they just come all around you, and it's quite a wonderful experience, but it also lets you have great access to get nice eye-level shots at the birds.
Awesome. Some really good tips, and some good, I think, words about making sure you give the birds plenty of space so that you're not disturbing them at the same time. So that's awesome. Clearly, Ben is a professional, so getting those images is what he's doing. Felicia, you have been working on shorebird conservation for a long time, and I'm curious if you would mind just sharing some of the most significant challenges that you see going forward for these birds.
Like we've said, there are many threats for the birds that are going to fly across the hemisphere. But I, thank goodness, work for South Carolina DNR, so I just look towards our beaches for our projects. And so focusing kind of on the threats and challenges that are occurring when the birds stop in South Carolina, I think the biggest threat that we can kind of manage is human disturbance. And kind of like we've kind of talked about during the presentations or the film, that stewards and education really can help minimize disturbance so these birds can rest and eat when they stop here. And just seeing this group, this festival, really gives me hope that that threat can be addressed and that people can live on the beach, play on the beach, and the birds can also thrive there.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thanks so much. Here's a question for you, Nate. In the last month or so, you've spent a lot of time following flocks of red knots all around South Carolina, hours and hours observing them. Could you share with everyone tonight what the average day looks like for a red knot?
Sure. The average day for a red knot is a lot of eating and sleeping. If high tide is 8 a.m. in the morning, they're going to be roosting on their high tide roost for a couple hours, some before and then some right after the peak. And then as soon as the first bird decides to lift off and go, they start streaming down the beaches until they can find that sweet spot. You'll often see it move from week to week. Sometimes it's Boardwalk 15, sometimes it's just past Beachwalker. So a lot of eating and sleeping.
Here's a question for all of you. Someone can answer this, maybe, but does anyone have any idea how they know where to go to find those food resources?
They definitely watch each other. I think some of it is speculation, so certain flocks land, but I've seen the birds. There's a degree of competition when knots see each other finding donax. They go right for those spots. It also is quite common for them to try and steal good fat donax from each other. But I think they watch each other and watch their behavior and key in on the motions, of their brethren when they look like they're on good forage. I think the motion of their body is different when they're finding donax on multiple probes than it is when they are moving fast because they're not finding any.
Any observations from time watching birds hop around to different food resources?
I think I can second what Ben says. They do this almost seems like a body slam to one another when they're going after that spot with intense donax. You'll see it if you watch them intensely. It's almost like a football player just tackling one of the other birds, and it's just to say, hey, get out the way. I want to eat right there.
Great. Felicia, here's a question for you. So red knots were the focus of tonight's program, but we've talked a little bit about some of the other shorebirds that are declining as well. So I'm curious, from your perspective, what are some of the other species that you're concerned about, and does red knot conservation protect those other species? And if so, is that one of the reasons that we focus on this one species? Like, why focus on red knots specifically?
Yeah, well, one reason we're focusing on red knots is because as our research is showing that South Carolina is very important for that species, but we have a lot of different types of shorebirds. Caitlin's amazing film and Benjamin's of all the shorebirds eating the horseshoe crab eggs just shows you the diversity of shorebirds we have in our coast. And unfortunately, most of the shorebirds are declining. So limiting disturbance specifically for red knots also helps a lot of the other species. Like reddy turnstones are on the beaches here, and they're also high Arctic nesters, so they're flying far. They could use protection. Sanderlings, the little shorebirds that follow the waves, they're also zipping up to the Arctic for a couple months and declining. So all the education and habitat protection can benefit red knots and other species.
Great. So we have a lot to thank red knots for. Ben, a question for you. Are you working on any other red knot projects, and how can we see more? Was this just a little wonderful teaser that we should all be very excited about?
This film that I showed tonight was a special edit for the Shorebird Festival this year, and I'm continuing to work on telling their story with the support of the Kiawah Conservancy, telling a longer version of what threats the knots are facing, and just more voices from the amazing communities around here, the stewardship community, the other representatives of researchers, people who have studied horseshoe crabs and have insights about what's going on in the horseshoe crab world, with lessons learned from Delaware Bay, where horseshoe crabs were they were harvested extensively, and then it was realized that they needed to kind of take a pause on that, and then researchers have been looking at the rebound of those crabs. So these other voices telling the story of the knot and their journeys and their struggles, and that is going to be done at the end of 2023, and so keep an eye out for it.
Very exciting. We've got a lot of questions from the audience about sort of some of the mechanics of migration. Thinking about how long it takes to migrate from Kiawah nonstop to the Arctic. And then some good questions too about sort of, is there a leader during migration? How do the birds move? Do they move as a group, or do they move in families? And then a question too about sort of what happens on that fall-bound migration when the adults leave the Arctic, and then we see a little bit later a wave of young birds, chicks, that migrate down without their parents guiding them. So I wondered if, and you can all probably chime in on this question, but if you would mind just sort of walking through that process of this journey of migration a little bit.
Benjamin, go
Close that.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry, I totally thought this was going to go to Felicia, I think. So,
Can you just basically tell us everything about migration? I guess we can start with, I think one of the really fascinating things that is just incredible to me is this idea that young birds migrate in the fall, which is actually July, starts in July, is fall migration, and they migrate down independent of the adults. And so maybe just talking a little bit about that whole process, if anybody's got some insights there.
well, one thing I think we could start it off with is just to talk about they are a fascinating species in that they have these different strategies. So a lot of people ask the question, well, why do some of the population, why does the Tierra del Fuego population go so far, and why do some of them stay in the southeast? I don't fully know the answer to that, other than just to know that that strategy over thousands of years has worked for that population, and clearly in coincidence with horseshoe crabs spawning and then other great food resources at their stopovers. But then the other strategies work as well for different populations, and I don't know if that's a really good answer, but it is. I think it's fascinating that the species has evolved so many different strategies.
Well, yeah, as Abby mentioned, the adults do leave the young in the Arctic when the young birds can thermoregulate. So basically the young birds are big enough, have enough feathers to keep warm. They know how to feed on their own. All these shorebirds, as soon as they're hatching, they're not fed by the parents, they're just feeding. But the parents are needed at the beginning to kind of protect them from predators and to keep them warm when it's really cold. But then the adults leave. They migrate south down to James Bay or Hudson Bay, and then the young stay in the Arctic, get fatter, get stronger, and then they migrate on their own down to James Bay. And I was lucky enough to go to James Bay a couple years during that time, and I saw the adults come, and then weeks later the juveniles came down. So it's just amazing that the juveniles are making that journey, not following adults. It's just an innate knowledge to go to James Bay and make a stop. So, and a lot of the birds, I was just kind of thinking about it this morning, looking at the satellite data from last year, and some of the stops some of the flights going up north are 1 to 2 days of flying. So these birds are not soaring like a vulture, they're actually flapping the entire time. But we do know shorebirds can fly up to a week. They can fly almost the entire hemisphere without stopping. So they are capable of making much farther, longer trips than our satellite tag data was showing.
The scientific answer might be that they have a little bit of magic, and we are constantly wowed the more we learn, maybe. We've got a couple good questions here One I think is pretty interesting, asking about the correlation of the decline of the red knot population when we think about the decline of other birds along the flyway. And this audience member specifically called out the decline of waterfowl species such as mallards, teal, gadwall, and pintails. And I think this is kind of an interesting question because historically waterfowl conservation has been somewhat of a success story. If we look at that research where we saw those very significant population declines over many different groups of birds, one of the few groups that's actually not declining is waterfowl. And that's in large part because of management. So I wondered if you would mind just touching a little bit about how some of the different management techniques really can have some pretty quick impacts for some of the shorebirds that we're concerned about, and maybe thinking a little bit about sort of the path forward and maybe some success stories when we think about shorebird conservation, if you've got any that come to mind. That's kind of a hard question. Sorry.
Well, I'm not sure, I don't think this is answering the question, but one thing to think about with the difference between waterfowl and shorebirds is that waterfowl produce a lot of young. So they're a little more resilient than shorebirds. A lot of shorebirds only have 3 eggs. And that may mean 1 or 2 chicks, whereas you may have seen ducklings on your pond and you can have a whole string of ducklings. So that in some countries they have shot shorebirds and they just cannot sustain hunting, whereas waterfowl, because they produce so many young, and it's also closely managed and watched with very limited hunting if the population crashes. It is capable, they can sustain some pressure from hunting, whereas shorebirds really can't. But that's not completely an answer to the question. Just some thoughts.
Those are great thoughts. I think maybe habitat management can be a real good answer as well for both species, waterfowl and shorebirds. And I think we talk a lot about management of disturbance, and so maybe if anybody has any thoughts about some of the actions that they see on the beaches here that have had an impact.
Well, all the wonderful work that's happening here in the Southeast in general with stewarding, I think, absolutely. Even in the 5 years that I've been visiting, I absolutely have seen a change on Seabrook and Kiawah with the work of the stewards. Such a change in how many people know. Like Betty said in the film, there are people who are the stewards that they don't wear a t-shirt, but they know enough that they are out there being stewards themselves, just sort of opportunistically. I think that sort of sea change of understanding and then a little bit of advocacy, even amongst the people who aren't actually actively stewarding, but they know enough to, they certainly know enough to respect and to tell others. I just see that that's been a huge change, and thanks to Betty and so many of you. I'm sure there are many stewards. Actually, raise your hand if you're a shorebird steward.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's awesome. One of the questions does actually sort of relate to stewarding, and that was the impacts that dogs have on red knots. I wondered if anybody might speak to that a little bit. Have you gotten to see, maybe in other places, impacts of dogs?
Dogs can be such a nuisance to them on the beach. Anytime they have to take up, that's energy spent, and those clams, like we were talking about earlier, as much as as many of them as they are here, still are not as nutritious, and it takes a lot for them to digest everything. So anytime they take up, it's always energy spent that they should be just saving. So seeing dogs just run through flocks can be pretty disheartening when you're on the beach, but that's why stewarding is so lovely. Get the word out to those folks, and hopefully they have a change of heart for them, seeing as how their dogs are just acting on instinct.
Yeah. Also, there's a lot of research that shows that birds on the beach, shorebirds in particular, are much more scared of dogs than humans. So even if a dog is on a leash, a bird may, get really stressed and may fly. And that's because they've evolved with coyotes, wolves, bobcats, foxes, all these predators. And so they're really alert when they see 4 legs and fur. So, yeah, unfortunately, I have a dog, I love it, but maybe the beach isn't the best place if you want thousands and thousands of knots to feed and rest peacefully.
I also have a dog that loves birds, and it's problematic. Maybe we'll sort of wind down here, but we did have one question about thinking about the impact of hurricane season, and I think that factors in a little bit to some of the larger patterns we're seeing with climate change and sea level rise. I wondered if you might just touch a little bit on some of the impacts that you all have seen for red knots and other shorebirds as it relates to hurricanes and climate change.
I have one comment. I live up in McClellanville near Cape Remain National Wildlife Refuge, and the beaches are eroding fast up there. And a lot of the beautiful dune areas with marsh behind them are now, we call it marsh relic, kind of right on the front beach is mud, and the knots love it. So right now we have lots of great shorebird habitat because of the hurricanes and the storms, but what's next? Because there's really nothing behind these mud flats. It's just open water. So in some ways, hurricanes are great for a couple years, and then it may be disastrous when the mud disappears and you just have open water and no shorebird habitat. So long term, not good. Short term, fantastic.
I think that even sometimes we see that with some of the predators too, when there's been a hurricane, and it can really knock back predator numbers for our nesting shorebirds. So it is a mixed bag that we're still learning about. And I know we're getting close on time, so I'm going to just turn it back to all 3 of you and say thank you first of all for your insights, and ask if there are any things that you would like to share with everyone tonight while you're center stage here and you've got a captive audience.
I'm absolutely amazed when I drove into Kiawah and saw the big shorebird banner. Kind of like Benjamin said, I've seen just a huge change in the last years, and it's just incredible, and it gives me hope, and just amazing how many people care now. And some people may be aware of rebuilding Crab Bank in Charleston Harbor. It's kind of a long story, but we had to raise over $1 million to rebuild this seabird sanctuary, and I thought, no way, impossible. And the entire community came together. Corporations gave money, school kids donated, there were bands, t-shirts, beer, everything for the birds, and we raised a lot of money, and it's because the entire community, the entire coast of South Carolina cares. And Janet's now monitoring Crab Bank. It has seabirds. She saw horseshoe crabs last week, so it's food for shorebirds. It's probably a resting place at night for all kind of shorebirds. So I think anything is possible.
I would say if you were utterly inspired by Ben's film and even peeped some of the light green colored flags in there, if you have a spotting scope or a telescope, you can meet me on the beach, and we'll be the boots on the ground folk reading those bands and getting those data points for all the other researchers.
And I think a lot of you understand this, and those of you who saw red knots today or will tomorrow, I hope you all understand. I know many of you do just how special of a situation it is that you all have here. I always say this, I think that this coast at this time of year is really unique on the entire continent. It is the place that you can see thousands of red knots in one place, gathered together, doing the amazing things that they do, whether it's the moving in response to the waves in unison or flying in unison. Just the experiences that you can have here over the next few days while they're still here, and then in upcoming years, you know, with our fingers crossed. I really appreciate it, and I encourage you all to tell more people about just how unique this place is, and how important it is for the birds